Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Our AI narration lets you delve into the wisdom of timeless books, extracting those golden nuggets of insight. Today we're looking at Simon Schama's The Fate of the Empire.
A sweeping look at Britain between 1776 and 2000.
Not just dates and battles, though, right?
No. Schama digs into how Britain grappled with losing its empire while trying to figure out, what being British even meant in a changing world.
It's like an identity crisis on a national scale.
Yeah, exactly. And he starts by looking at this shift in the 18th century.
A shift in what?
How people thought about nature and culture. You had thinkers like Rousseau.
Oh, I know Rousseau. Back to nature, right.
Exactly. He saw the countryside as this pure, liberating place, totally opposite to cities, which he saw as, corrupt and artificial.
So did he, live in a log cabin.
Funny enough, he visited London, thought it'd be this haven of liberty, but was totally put off by the urban chaos. Kind of ironic.
Shows how complex these ideas can be. It's not always black and white.
And this idea of nature being good really impacted education, too.
You mean like kids playing in the dirt?
Oh, it was more about nurturing kids' natural instincts and letting them learn through play.
Instead of drilling facts into their heads.
Yeah. It was a total shift from seeing kids as empty vessels to seeing them as having their own potential to, blossom.
That makes sense. Makes me think of Thomas Buick, that nature illustrator.
Right. His upbringing was all about exploring nature, drawing what he saw, learning because he was curious.
Not because some teacher was forcing him.
Huge difference. But speaking of changes, we got to talk about land enclosure.
That doesn't sound very nature-friendly.
It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, yeah, it made farming more efficient. But on the other, it kicked a lot of small farmers off the land they depended on.
Because suddenly all the common land was fenced off.
Exactly. These smallholders had no choice but to become wage laborers. Some argued it created more jobs, but the displacement was real.
Progress always has its winners and losers.
And Schama doesn't shy away from that. He shows both sides, lets the reader grapple with the messiness of it all.
That's what makes good history, right? It's not just a neat story.
Totally. And speaking of messy, this period saw a ton of social reform movements popping up.
Like what? What were people concerned about?
Oh, all sorts of things. Prison reform, child labor, how unmarried mothers were treated.
Big issues.
Yeah.
Any specific examples?
The campaign against child chimney sweeps. Horrible stuff.
Yeah.
These kids, 8 years old, sometimes younger, forced to climb these narrow chimneys. Super dangerous, unhealthy.
Can't imagine that.
Yeah. Reformers were outraged, saw it as pure exploitation, and they did get some laws passed, but enforcing them was another story.
Sounds like the fight for social justice is never really over.
And then, boom, the French Revolution happens, changes everything.
Didn't they, chop off some heads?
It was more than just that. The revolution's ideas, they spread like wildfire, even across the Channel to Britain.
So Britain was watching all this unfold.
And arguing about it. Some saw it as a continuation of their own fight for liberty. Others were terrified it would lead to chaos in Britain, too.
Two very different reactions.
Yeah. You had Richard Price, a minister, who basically said the monarchy should answer to the people. Totally radical for the time.
And on the other side?
Edmund Burke. He wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he basically freaked out about tradition and order being destroyed.
Like the opposite of Price.
Totally. And everyone's arguing, pamphlets flying around, speeches, even cartoons making fun of both sides.
Sounds intense. Was anyone defending the revolution?
Oh, yeah. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote this awesome takedown of Burke, pointing out how hypocritical it was to defend hereditary monarchy.
Wollstonecraft, didn't she also write about women's rights?
Yeah, she was amazing. Her writing paved the way for her more famous book on women's equality and education, way ahead of her time.
So the French Revolution really stirred things up in Britain.
It absolutely did. And out of all this debate, new radical political movements started to emerge.
So people wanting more change. More radical change.
Exactly. Figures like Thomas Paine, his book Rights of Man was a bestseller. People were fired up about democratic reforms.
Not just talking about it, but actually organizing, right?
Absolutely. The London Corresponding Society was huge. They mobilized working-class folks, pushing for voting rights and more frequent parliaments.
So the government must have been thrilled about this.
Not at all. They saw it as a threat, especially since there were connections to similar movements in Ireland and Scotland.
Things were heating up all over.
Big time. It was a time when the whole system was being questioned. Nothing was sacred.
Makes you wonder how individuals navigated all this.
Well, take William Wordsworth, the poet. Started out a huge fan of the French Revolution.
So Team Price.
Basically. But as things got more violent, as he saw the reality of war firsthand, his views changed.
War has a way of doing that.
It does. He traveled in France, had a relationship there. All these experiences shaped his thinking.
So his poetry reflected this shift.
Absolutely. He went from celebrating revolution to lamenting war's impact on people and nations, became this poet of disillusionment.
But still found solace in nature, right? That was always a theme for him.
Yeah, nature was his constant, even amidst the chaos of human affairs.
It's fascinating how history is never static.
Yeah.
It's all about change and how people respond to it.
And one of the biggest changes in this period was the Irish Rebellion of 1798.
Ah, the Irish. Always fighting the British.
It was more complex than that. Centuries of English rule, resentment was building, and finally, it exploded.
But didn't end well for the Irish, did it?
It was brutal on both sides. The rebellion was crushed, but it left a lasting scar.
And led to Ireland becoming part of the United Kingdom, right?
Exactly. The Act of Union in 1801 abolished the Irish Parliament, basically absorbed them into Britain.
Not exactly a peaceful merger.
No. Many in Ireland saw it as a betrayal, another loss of their independence.
It shows that the British Empire wasn't this happy family.
It was definitely complicated, full of tensions and contradictions, especially in places like Ireland where national identity clashed with British ambitions.
So from nature worship to social reform to revolution and rebellion, that's a lot to pack into just a few decades.
And we haven't even gotten to the 19th century yet.
Buckle up, folks. This deep dive is just getting started.
We're just scratching the surface of what Skama covers in The Fate of the Empire.
And it's already clear this isn't your typical history lesson.
It's a journey through ideas, events, and human stories that shaped Britain and, in many ways, the world we live in today.
Can't wait to see where it takes us next.
And as we roll into the 20th century, things get even more interesting for the British Empire.
More interesting, you mean things start to unravel.
Exactly. Nationalist movements, especially in colonies like India, they're gaining momentum. People are demanding more autonomy, questioning the whole idea of British rule.
So the empire is starting to feel the heat.
Big time. And a key figure emerges in this struggle, Mohandas Gandhi.
Oh, Gandhi. Nonviolent resistance, right.
Exactly. He challenged the British not through warfare, but through boycotts, protests, civil disobedience. Really powerful stuff.
And a huge headache for the British, I imagine.
Totally. How do you justify using force against people who are committed to nonviolence? It just made Britain look bad on the world stage.
Exposed the hypocrisy of an empire that preached freedom but didn't practice it everywhere.
Exactly. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, World War I breaks out.
The Great War. Talk about a turning point.
It had a massive impact on British society. The war started with all this patriotic fervor, but it quickly became a brutal, drawn-out conflict. The casualties were staggering.
Shattered that whole image of European civilization, didn't it?
Completely. And back home, things were changing too. With so many men off fighting, women stepped up, took on jobs in factories and shipyards.
It was a moment of empowerment for women, wasn't it?
It was. But the war also highlighted the class divides in Britain. The upper classes romanticized it, but the working class bore the brunt of the suffering.
It's like that old saying, right? War is rich old men talking and young men dying.
Sad but true. And after the war, Britain was in a tough spot. The economy was a mess, people were restless, and the empire was even weaker.
A recipe for instability.
For sure. And that's when you start to see new political ideologies gaining traction, like socialism.
Inspired by what was happening in Russia.
Exactly. People were questioning the whole capitalist system, demanding more economic equality.
Big, bold ideas floating around.
And these weren't just theoretical debates. They were playing out in the streets, in the factories, in parliament. Everyone was vying for power.
Sounds chaotic.
It was a time of great uncertainty, but also a time of possibility. Old systems were crumbling, and it was anyone's guess what would replace them.
So Britain's coming out of World War I, battered, bruised, and facing a whole new set of challenges.
And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the 1930s hit.
The Great Depression. Talk about a gut punch.
Millions plunged into poverty. It was a global crisis, but it hit Britain hard.
And when people are desperate, that's when extremist ideas can take root.
Exactly. You see the rise of fascism, especially in Germany with Hitler, and in Britain there's this debate about how to deal with this growing threat.
So, fight or appease?
That was the big question. Some, like Winston Churchill, saw the danger of Nazi Germany right away. Others wanted to avoid another war at all costs.
Appeasement. Didn't work out so well, did it?
No, it just emboldened Hitler, gave him time to rearm, and eventually unleash World War II.
So Britain finds itself in another world war, this time against an even more formidable enemy.
And this time, it's a fight for their very survival, a battle for freedom and democracy against the tyranny of Nazi Germany.
With Churchill at the helm.
The man for the hour, as they say. The war lasted 6 long years, fought across the globe. It tested Britain's strength and resolve like never before.
They ultimately won, but at a tremendous cost.
Millions dead, cities destroyed, and the empire, well, it was on its last legs.
The war had depleted Britain's resources and its will to hold on to its colonies.
Exactly. And it had also exposed the shortcomings of their social safety net. People realized things needed to change.
So after the war, there was a real push for social reform.
Yeah. A new kind of social contract emerged. The idea that the government had a responsibility to care for its citizens, provide healthcare, education, a basic standard of living.
The birth of the welfare state.
A radical shift for Britain, but one that was born out of the shared sacrifice and hardship of war. And it wasn't just rebuilding at home. Britain had to figure out, what does a post-imperial world even look like?
Yeah, after centuries of running this global empire, suddenly it'd stay over.
Not overnight, but the war definitely accelerated things. Colonies started declaring independence left and right.
Must have been bittersweet. Like, proud of what they'd built, but also missing it.
It was a huge blow to their identity. Like, if you're not the empire anymore, who are you? What's your place in the world?
And all this is happening while the Cold War's heating up. New superpowers emerging.
Talk about a complicated time. And then you have the Suez Crisis in '56.
That was a mess.
Major mess. Britain tries to flex its muscles in Egypt. Doesn't go well.
They wanted to control the Suez Canal.
They thought they could still throw their weight around, but it backfired big time.
Humiliating, I bet.
It showed the world the old rules didn't apply anymore. Britain wasn't calling the shots.
Hard to swallow after centuries at the top.
Definitely. And from there, it's all about adapting, figuring out how to balance their interests with, being a democracy.
Not trying to rule the world anymore.
The world had changed. Britain had to change with it.
Sounds like a lot of soul searching.
A lot of it. Shama really captures that in the book. This sense of, who are we now? What do we stand for?
Big questions. And the empire's legacy. That's got to be complicated, too.
It is. It's a mixed bag. Progress, but also exploitation. Innovation, but also oppression.
It's not all sunshine and roses.
Definitely not. And those shadows, they still linger today. It's part of who Britain is.
It makes you think history isn't just something in the past.
It shapes everything. Our identities, our perspectives, how we see the world.
And Shama, he doesn't let you forget that. The fate of the empire. It's not just a history book.
It's a story about people, their choices, their struggles, the things they left behind.
It's about understanding who we are, where we come from.
And maybe even where we're going. So yeah, if you're fascinated by history, by how the past shapes the present.
And who isn't?
Pick up The Fate of the Empire. You won't regret it.
And that's our deep dive for today. Big thanks to our expert for taking us on this journey through British history.
It's been a pleasure. Always happy to chat about history.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
And don't forget to check out the link in the show notes to get your own copy of The Fate of the Empire. It's a must-read.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.